September 3rd, 1260. General Baybars presses his heels into his horse's flanks and looks out over the valley opening up before him. Behind him, the most feared army in the Islamic world. Ahead of him, the army that swept through everything in its path, from Beijing to the banks of the Danube. The only army that, in 50 years, no one had been able to stop. And here, in a valley in northern modern-day Israel, everything was about to change. But not in the way you might think. Because Baybars' secret wasn't some brilliant tactic no one else had thought of. It was something much stranger. The warriors who were going to defeat the Mongols were, in every meaningful way, the exact same warriors as the Mongols. Not metaphorically, literally, but that's yet to come. First, you need to understand what the Mongols were, what they meant, what happened when they arrived. Because this wasn't a normal war. It was something different. It was the end of the world. In 1206, Genghis Khan unified the nomadic tribes of the northern Asian steppes and forged the most effective engine of conquest human history had ever seen. It wasn't just an army. It was a system, a precision machine, calibrated for a single function, destroying anything that stood in its way. Mongol cavalrymen didn't fight like anyone else. They moved like water. They attacked, retreated, and struck back from impossible angles. They didn't need elaborate supply lines the way other armies did. They lived off the land, moved at speeds that seemed supernatural by medieval standards, and wielded terror as a weapon just as lethal as any arrow or spear. In the 50 years since Genghis, the Mongol Empire had expanded from the Pacific coast all the way to the edges of Central Europe. China had been conquered, Persia demolished, Russia subjugated. The Teutonic and Polish knights were crushed at Legnica in 1241. The Hungarians were wiped out at Mohi that same year. No one in open battle had been able to stop the Mongols. No one. And then came Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, with one specific goal: to wipe out the Islamic caliphates and push the Mongol border all the way to Egypt. In February 1258, Hulagu arrived in Baghdad. Baghdad. We need to pause here for a moment. Because Baghdad in 1258 wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of the Islamic world. The throne of the Abbasid Caliphate had stood there for 500 years. It housed the Grand Library, filled with manuscripts spanning the entire history of human civilization: medicine, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics. It was the center of knowledge for the known world. In 2 weeks, Hulagu destroyed all of it. Caliph al-Mustasim was captured. He wasn't killed immediately. The Mongols held superstitions about spilling royal blood. Rolled up in carpets, he was trampled to death by Mongol horses. Medieval estimates speak of hundreds of thousands dead. Modern historians calculate massive casualties, maybe 100, maybe 200,000 souls. The Tigris River, the chronicles say, ran red with blood for days. The Grand Library was burned to the ground. Manuscripts were thrown into the river until the waters turned black with ink. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had stood for 5 centuries, ceased to exist in a matter of days. The psychological shockwave that swept through the Islamic world has no easy modern comparison. It was as if the cultural and spiritual center of the universe for an entire civilization had been erased overnight. There was no precedent for this. There was no playbook on how to react. Just horror, paralysis, and the terrifying certainty that the Mongols were coming next. And they came. In January 1260, Aleppo fell. The residents who couldn't escape were massacred. In March 1260, Damascus surrendered. The Syrian rulers either died or fled. Kitbuka, the Mongol general commanding Hulagu's western force, walked the streets of Damascus with his allies, including the Christian king of Armenia and a crusader prince. To any observer, this was the end. The Nile was only a few days' march away. Egypt was next. The crusader states, the Frankish kingdoms that had survived on the Levantine coast for nearly 200 years, were paralyzed. Some believed the Mongols were potential allies against Islam. Others simply didn't know what to do. The world had changed so fast that no one could process it. And then there was Egypt. In Egypt, there were the Mamluks. But what you need to understand about the Mamluks, and what most people never learn, is that they were, in every meaningful way, the exact same warriors as the Mongols. The secret to why this was possible lies in something no other kingdom in the world had ever done before. Not metaphorically, literally. The Mamluk system was one of the most extraordinary institutions of the medieval world. The word Mamluk means, in Arabic, one who is owned, a slave. And yes, they were slaves, but the word fails to capture the reality. Because the Mamluk system wasn't about holding people in captivity. It was about forging warriors. Here is how it worked. Islamic leaders, sultanates, and caliphs bought young children, mostly Turkic and Kipchak youths from the Central Asian steppes, from slave merchants operating along the trade routes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Children of 8, 10, 12 years old, torn from their steppe tribes. And then they trained them. Mamluk training was called Furusiya, a set of equestrian martial arts that included high-level horsemanship, mounted archery, spear handling, swordsmanship, and cavalry tactics. It was a complete, strict, and demanding military education that lasted for years. When a Mamluk completed his training, he was manumitted, officially freed, and integrated into his lord's elite force. But the crucial thing about where they came from, the steppes, the Kipchaks, and the steppe Turks from whom Mamluk recruits were drawn, were the exact same peoples who fed the Mongol armies. The same equestrian traditions, the same archery techniques, the same visceral bond with horses from childhood, the same tolerance for conditions that would break soldiers who grew up in cities or on farmlands. Think about that. Think about what that means. Every nation, every kingdom, every caliphate the Mongols had faced and destroyed fought differently. Heavily armored European warriors, reliant on shock cavalry in open terrain, Syrian infantry archers, Persian cavalry, fast but untrained for Mongol maneuver warfare, Chinese armies, formidable in defense and siege technology, but not in the mobile warfare of the steppes. The Mongols didn't just win through brute force. They won because they knew how to do things their enemies simply couldn't answer. The feigned retreat, faking a withdrawal to lure the enemy into a disadvantageous position. The hail of arrows fired from a horse at a full gallop. The ability to look like they were falling back, only to attack from a completely different angle a split second later. No Western or Middle Eastern army intuitively understood these tactics, not because they were stupid, but because they were the products of a different culture. You don't learn how to ride the steppes growing up in a castle or a merchant city. The Mamluks didn't have that problem. A Mamluk raised on the Kipchak steppes and trained in Furusiya for 10 years was, functionally, the equivalent of a Mongol warrior. Same skills, same instincts, the exact same visceral understanding of how steppe cavalry thinks and moves. And what separated the Mamluks from their steppe peers was the added discipline. Furusiya wasn't just physical training, it was doctrine. Formalized tactics, drills repeated until they became muscle memory, a clear chain of command. The Mongols were extraordinary. The Mamluks were extraordinary. and organized in a way that allowed for a tactical complexity requiring precise coordination. When the news from Baghdad reached Cairo, the Sultan of Egypt wasn't looking at an army of invincible aliens from another world. He was looking at steppe warriors, and the Mamluks knew steppe warriors better than any other force in the Islamic world. The question wasn't whether they could fight. The question was, who had the courage to force the battle? In 1259, Qutuz seized power in Cairo through a coup d'etat. It wasn't his first experience with violent power. He was a Mamluk himself, of Turkic origin, and had risen through the Egyptian political system alongside and in opposition to other Mamluk leaders. The Mamluk world was brutally competitive, and Qutuz had survived it. What he inherited was an existential crisis. The Mongols were in Damascus. The Abbasid Caliphate had ceased to exist. The Islamic states to the north and east of Egypt had been destroyed or subjugated. The Nile was the next natural border, and everyone knew that natural borders rarely stopped the Mongols for long. Most leaders in this situation would have waited, bolstered Egypt's defenses, tried to negotiate, waited to see what the Mongols would do before committing their forces. Qutuz did not do that. Qutuz looked at the situation and made a decision that many of his advisors must have considered suicidal. He would march straight into Mongol-controlled Syria, not to defend Egypt's borders, to force a battle before the Mongols had time to consolidate Syria and build logistical bases for an invasion of Africa. It was an aggressive logic of deterrence. If you wait, you lose. If you attack while the enemy is still overextended and far from their bases, you have a fighting chance. But there was a routing problem. To reach Syria, the Mamluk army had to cross through the Crusader states along the Levantine coast, the Frankish kingdom surviving in cities like Acre and Tyre. The Crusaders were in an impossible position. The Mongols had approached them with alliance proposals. There were Christians in the Mongol ranks. There was Mongol interest in weakening Islam. There were communications between the Ilkhanate and the papacy. Some Crusader nobles held Mongol sympathies, but most realized, correctly, that a complete Mongol victory in the Levant would be no better for the Christian kingdoms than maintaining the existing balance of power. The nobles of Acre made a crucial decision. They wouldn't fight the Mamluks. They would let Qutuz's army pass. And not only that, they would allow the Mamluks to resupply and rest in Crusader territory. This was massive. Without this safe passage, Qutuz would have to fight on one front while having another potentially hostile power behind him. With it, his army would reach Syria rested and with their supply lines intact. And then came another piece that completely changed the geometry of the battle. Munka Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, had died in 1259. His death triggered a succession crisis in the heart of the empire, with multiple candidates positioning themselves. Hulagu Khan, commander of the Western Campaign, needed to return east to participate in the political disputes that would determine who controlled the largest empire in the world. Hulagu withdrew most of his army. He left behind an expeditionary force commanded by Kitbuka, an experienced and trusted general. Estimates speak of 10,000 to 20,000 men, a serious force, but a fraction of the total Mongol might that had destroyed Baghdad. Qutuz knew this. His intelligence knew the size of Kitbuka's force, and Qutuz knew that this was the window, perhaps the only window, that would ever exist. Hulagu would return. He would bring reinforcements. The numerical advantage the Mongols had temporarily lost would be restored. If Egypt was going to fight, it was now. Qutuz's gamble was everything. If it failed, Egypt would fall. There was no second chance, no fallback position. It was a gamble for existence. and Kutuz took the gamble. Kutuz was the strategist who forced the battle, but Baibars was the tactician who would win it. And what Baibars was about to do was something no army had ever attempted against the Mongols, using their own weapon against them. Baibars, of Turkic origins like the other elite Mamluks, was the commander of the Mamluk vanguard, the cavalrymen sent ahead of the main army for reconnaissance, skirmishes, and in this case, to choose the terrain where the decisive battle would take place. Baibars had a specific advantage that made this mission natural for him. He had fought against the Mongols before, in previous battles in Syria. He understood how they thought, how they moved, how they reacted, and this understanding led him to a clear conclusion about what needed to happen. You can't beat the Mongols in an open field using conventional tactics. They're better at it than anyone. You have to use their tactics against them. The feigned retreat was the Mongols' most iconic tactical weapon. It worked like this. A part of the Mongol force would advance, make contact with the enemy, feign a defeat, and retreat in apparent panic. The enemy, seeing the Mongols flee, would charge in pursuit. And then, when the enemy was overextended, out of formation, far from their starting point, hidden Mongol forces would emerge from the flanks and complete the encirclement. The pursuit became a massacre. It was elegant, it was devastating, and it had worked dozens of times. Baibars wanted to use exactly this against Kitbuka. But for the feigned retreat to work, you need terrain. You need somewhere your hidden forces can wait, unseen, until the right moment. And you need a corridor that funnels the pursuing enemy into the trap, preventing them from escaping through the flanks before the encirclement closes. Baibars found this place in the Jezreel Valley, in Palestine, specifically in the region around Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, a name drawn from the biblical legend of the battle in that same valley where David allegedly killed Goliath. Here, the Galilean hills rise on the northern and southern edges of the valley, creating natural walls that squeeze any force moving along the east-west axis. The secret was in the ground itself, in the hills surrounding the valley, in the way the terrain funneled any army that entered, like a funnel that narrowed imperceptibly to anyone not looking at the map. It was simple, it was invisible, and it was exactly the kind of trap the Mongols, in decades of victories, had never found used against them, because they were always the ones building it. The plan Baibars conceived had a brutal clarity. A visible Mamluk force, Baibars' own vanguard, would make contact with Kitbuka's army. After a brief engagement, they would retreat in a controlled manner, inviting Kitbuka to pursue them into the valley. At the same time, Mamluk forces hidden on the high ground to the north and south would wait for the moment when the Mongol army was sufficiently overextended inside the valley. Then they would emerge from the flanks, closing the encirclement around Kitbuka. The irony was perfect. The Mongols would be annihilated by the very same maneuver they had employed to subjugate entire civilizations. The hunters were about to step into a trap made for hunters. Baibars spent days reconnoitering the terrain, positioning the hidden forces, determining the angles of attack. Kutuz's main force would remain as the backbone, the anchor that would absorb the Mongol impact in the center while the flanks closed in. It needed to work in unison. A false start to the retreat too early would reveal the trap. Too much delay, and Kitbuka could break through before the encirclement closed. And there was one more layer that most people don't realize. The retreat needed to be convincing, not just visually, but tactically. Baibars' Mamluks would have to put up a real fight before retreating. Fight with enough ferocity to make Kitbuka believe he was winning, not just chasing fugitives. Because an experienced Mongol general wouldn't pursue an army that simply ran away. He would pursue an army that was buckling under real pressure. On the morning of September 3, 1260, the positions were set. Baybars's vanguard marched ahead. Kutuz's main army was positioned, waiting. In the hills, in the shadows, the hidden forces waited for the signal. The most feared fighting force of the era was marching blindly into the abyss. Not out of stupidity, but because they had fallen into the web of adversaries who mastered their warrior psyche. They would soon realize that the evasive maneuver, once lethal against so many empires, had become the trigger for their own obliteration. And Kitbuka advanced through the valley. The first contact was exactly what Baybars needed it to be. Kitbuka's vanguard encountered Baybars's force in the eastern part of the valley, before the main choke point of the terrain. The initial battle was real arrows and charges, men and horses, the kind of combat the Mamluks had been trained to execute since childhood. Baybars needed the fighting to look genuine. He needed Kitbuka to believe he was fighting the enemy's main line. A feigned retreat that looks fake doesn't work. Baybars's Mamluks fought fiercely, and then they began to fall back. A controlled retreat is one of the most difficult maneuvers to pull off in a medieval battle. It requires every rider, in the heat of combat, to resist the urge to keep fighting or flee in genuine panic, and instead execute a disciplined, coordinated fallback at just the right speed, fast enough to look real, slow enough to maintain contact and keep the bait on the hook. You're pretending to be defeated without actually being defeated. It is an act of theater performed while arrows are crossing the air all around you. Baybars executed it. Kitbuka, seeing the Mamluks retreat, did what Mongol generals are trained to do when the enemy falls back. He gave chase. And here is the crucial thing about that decision. Kitbuka wasn't stupid. He was a seasoned general. But the feigned retreat was a tactic so deeply ingrained in Mongol military thinking, so automatically associated with opportunity and advantage, that it was almost impossible not to pursue. It was like handing a blank check to the Mongols. Their entire military upbringing told them to cash it. Kitbuka accepted. The Mongol army followed Baybars into the valley, entering the corridor of terrain that Baybars had chosen. The hills of the valley rose to the north and south. The Mongol army was compressing, funneling into a narrower space as it pushed forward. But the Mongols didn't see this as a trap. They saw it as a pursuit, as victory in the making. Then the forces from the hills came down. From the high ground to the north and south of the valley, the Mamluk forces that had waited for hours in their hidden positions now emerged in unison, hundreds of riders pouring down the slopes all at once, the thunder of hooves multiplied by the valley's stone walls. Cavalry flowing down the hillsides like water finding the lowest level, enveloping the flanks of the Mongol army that had advanced right into the trap. To the Mongols in the center of the valley, the horizon to the north and south had simply exploded. The encirclement wasn't quite complete yet, but the geometry had changed. The Mongols now faced pressure from the front, where Baybars had halted his retreat and turned to fight. Pressure from the flanks, where forces were descending from the hills. And behind them, the valley narrowed. The main force of Kutuz was advancing to close off the eastern exit. For the first time in decades of Mongol warfare, Kitbuka looked out across a battlefield and saw a trap closing around him. What most armies would have done at that moment was psychologically collapse. The realization of being cornered, the sudden awareness that their victory had been an illusion and that they were the ones being played, would have sparked sheer panic. Kitbuka's Mongols did not panic. They turned and fought. This is what modern historians sometimes underestimate about Ain Jalut. It wasn't a clean victory. Surrounded, Kitbuka's Mongols responded in the only language they knew, attack. Instead of attempting an orderly retreat or surrender, Kitbuka threw the full weight of his army against the center of the Mamluk line. It was hard, it was fierce, and for one dangerous moment, it almost worked. The Mamluk right flank buckled under the Mongol pressure. It wasn't a total collapse, but it was enough to create a crisis. When a flank begins to buckle in a medieval battle, the danger isn't just local. A buckling flank threatens the center, which starts to feel exposed and can begin to fragment. A battle line is like a chain. You break one link, and the whole structure starts to fail. The Mamluk center began to fracture. Think about what that means in that specific moment. Baybars had executed the feigned retreat with surgical precision. The terrain had worked exactly as planned. The forces from the hills had swept down at the perfect time. The trap was closing, and now the center was giving way. The battle that was being won by the most elegant ambush of the century was slipping into the abyss because of something no tactic can control. The physical and psychological pressure of cornered men who refused to die quietly. This was the moment that could have changed everything. If the center collapsed, Kitbuka could tear open an exit, split the Mamluk army, and turn the encirclement into a rout. The dead at Ain Jalut could have been Mamluks. Egypt could have fallen in the winter of 1260. And then Qutuz did something that transformed this moment of crisis into the defining moment of the century. The Sultan of Egypt took off his helmet. On a medieval battlefield, a helmet wasn't just protection, it was identity. With the helmet on, the Sultan was just another rider, hard to distinguish in the chaos of combat. Without the helmet, anyone could see him. His own men could see him, the face of the man who had gambled everything on that day. Qutuz threw his helmet to the ground, cast his shield aside after it, and charged on horseback into the breaking line. Not as a leader giving orders from a safe position. As a combatant, on the line, in the chaos, where arrows crossed, and death was random and immediate. And he screamed, "Wa Islama! Oh, Islam!" An invocation that was simultaneously a prayer and a war cry, the kind of call that isn't calculated but born of something deeper than tactics. It was the Sultan calling his men not to follow an order, but to die or conquer with him. The effect was immediate. There is something in humans, something ancient, probably primal, that responds in a visceral way when the leader risks the exact same thing they ask you to risk. The soldier who was considering retreating sees the Sultan charging forward. The equation changes. Retreating becomes impossible, not because someone orders it, but because something deeper than fear tells you that you cannot let that man die alone. The Mamluk line stabilized. Not immediately, not in an orderly fashion, not with the elegance of a planned maneuver, but it stabilized. The cavalrymen who were giving way turned around. Those who were hesitating charged. The right flank stopped buckling. The center stopped fracturing. And with the center stable, the encirclement came back to life. What Qutuz did in that moment wasn't just saving a battle. He saved the battle that saved Egypt, perhaps Africa, perhaps the entire course of what Islam and Eastern Mediterranean civilization would become in the following centuries. All of this in a moment of a sultan throwing his helmet to the ground and shouting the name of what he loved. With the Mamluk center stabilized and the flanks still pressing in, the encirclement around Kitbuka was completed. The Mongols, who had pursued Baybars into the valley, now found themselves trapped. Ahead, Qutuz's line, now anchoring with all the authority of a sultan who had personally stabilized the crisis. On the flanks, the forces that had descended from the hills squeezed them laterally. And behind, the valley closed. The Mongols tried to break through. It's what they did. When surrounded, they didn't wait for death. they attacked. They looked for a weak point, an escape angle, somewhere they could break the line and reform on the outside. It was the instinct of an army that had won wars doing exactly that, finding the point of least resistance and exploiting it. But Ain Jalut offered no points of least resistance. The hills closed off the flanks. The Mamluks, unlike the European enemies the Mongols had broken through before, did not give in to panic at the sight of a desperate charge. They were children of the same steppes, trained by the same instincts. They knew what a desperate charge was. They knew it didn't mean strength, but desperation. Kitbuka was seen in the middle of the chaos, fighting. Not fleeing, fighting. His horse was struck down or wounded. He fell, and he was captured alive. Brought before Kutuz, Kitbuka did not beg. He did not ask for terms. According to the chronicles that record what he said, he carried himself with the sober dignity of someone who understood what had happened but refused to show terror. The chronicles record that he told Kutuz something to this effect, that killing Kitbuka would not save the Sultan from the Mongols, that Hulagu would return, that an army that had conquered the world would not be stopped by a defeat in a Palestinian valley, that Kitbuka's death would be avenged. It was defiance. It was perhaps the Mongol general's genuine belief that his empire was destined for inevitable victory. It was also, inadvertently, a revelation about Mongol psychology. Even captured, even with his army destroyed, the general thought in terms of future vengeance because the idea of permanent defeat did not fit into the Mongol mindset. He was wrong about the strategic trajectory, but he was right that the Mongols would return. They would come several times. Baybars would defeat them repeatedly in the following years. But Ain Jalut, as a turning point, had happened. The invincibility of the Mongols in the open field had been shattered by people who understood how the Mongols thought, because they were, in essence, from the same tradition. Kitbuka was executed on the battlefield. The valley now belonged to the Mamluks. The victory was absolute. Kitbuka's army had been destroyed. The Mongol general was dead. Syria, which had seemed lost, was open to be retaken. Egypt was safe. The gates of Africa remained closed to the Mongol advance. Kutuz marched north with his victorious army. There was work to do. Damascus needed to be recovered. The administration of Syria needed to be established. The new border with what remained of Mongol power in the east needed to be consolidated. The Sultan, who had wagered everything and won, now needed to convert military victory into political order. Baybars rode beside him. Baybars, who had designed the trap that worked, who had orchestrated the maneuver with impeccable timing, who had positioned the forces in the hills, who had turned the Mongols' most iconic tactic into the instrument of their defeat. What no one was saying out loud, not yet, was what Baybars wanted next. The medieval chronicles are vague on the exact details, on what had been promised and what had been denied. There is talk of a dispute over a governorship, over some prize or position that Baybars expected to receive as a reward for his role in the victory, and that Kutuz had granted to another. There is talk of accumulated personal rivalries, of tensions between different groups within Mamluk politics, of ambitions that Ain Jalut had clearly revealed to be incompatible. What we know for sure is the outcome. On the journey back to Egypt, Kutuz was assassinated. Baybars was among the conspirators. That was how Mamluk politics worked. It wasn't a system that sent leaders into exile or comfortable imprisonment. It was a system of military elites who settled power disputes with the speed and permanence of a blade. Kutuz had risen to power through a coup. And now, just weeks after the most important battle of the century in the Islamic world, the Sultan who had summoned and won that battle was dead. Baybars became the Sultan of Egypt. What followed in the decades after Ain Jalut confirmed that Baybars was as extraordinary in power as he had been on the battlefield. The Mongols, as Kitbuka had predicted, returned multiple times, with renewed forces trying to break what had been broken in September 1260. Baybars defeated them repeatedly. He consolidated Mamluk control over Syria. He led campaigns that gradually wiped out the Crusader states of the Levant. The man who had killed the Sultan that ordered the Battle of Ain Jalut built upon that victory the power that transformed the Middle East for the next 2 centuries. This was the Mamluk world, brilliant and violent, capable of producing both the most sophisticated military strategy of the century and the coldest possible betrayal, sometimes by the same hands, sometimes on the very same day. So what exactly happened at Ain Jalut? The idea that the Mongols were unbeatable in the open field wasn't just propaganda. It was based on hard evidence. No one had ever decisively defeated them in an open field battle. Ain Jalut was the first time, and the significance of a first time cannot be understated. It changes what people believe to be possible. Strategically, the battle set the western boundary of the Ilkhanate essentially at the Euphrates River. The Mongols never successfully crossed into Africa. They never established the permanent dominance over the Levant that had seemed so imminent in the fall of 1260. The westward expansion of the largest land empire in human history ground to a halt in that valley. Why there? Why not at some other defensive point, in some other battle? Because the only warriors in the world who had the right tools were the Mamluks. And the decisive weapon wasn't just who they were, it was where Baybars positioned them. The lethal advantage was hidden in the terrain itself. The Galilean slopes squeezed the Mongol advance into a dead-end corridor, turning the hunt into a slaughterhouse. A stretch of land that any army would cross without a second thought, and that Baybars manipulated into the ultimate execution blade. The story of Ain Jalut is the story of a mirror. The Mongol Empire, expanding westward, eventually met an enemy forged from the very same human material. The Central Asian steppes, the horse and bow culture, the tactical instincts that only develop when you grow up in a world where the horse is the center of everything. And when that mirror finally faced what was left of Hulagu's army in that September of 1260, the outcome was not decided by technological superiority nor by overwhelming numbers. It was decided by a general who used the terrain as a weapon, by a sultan who tore off his helmet when the line was breaking, and by warriors who recognized the reflection of themselves in their enemy. Ain Jalut didn't just save Egypt. It saved trade routes, centers of learning, and entire populations that stood in the path of an army that had turned Baghdad into a killing field. What would have happened to North Africa and the Islamic Mediterranean if the Mongols had crossed the Nile, we will never know. But we do know that they didn't cross it. The Spring of Goliath was where the myth of Mongol invincibility died. And it died the only way such myths ever die, not by argument, not by decree, but through a real confrontation with someone who refused to accept that it was true. That was the history you didn't know. The ground beneath Baybars's feet was the weapon nobody saw coming. If this story changed how you think about how wars are truly won, share it with someone who appreciates real history. And if you want to keep exploring the moments that altered the course of the world, subscribe. There's much more to come.